All right. So today we're continuing on. We're not done with the story of Joseph yet. There's still, we at least have 2 more Sundays we're working on this. But today we probably are going to look at what was the most joyous reunion that we have seen yet since we've been through here. You may remember last time was part 3. I could have called this part 4 because it really is a continuation of the same story. But it isn't. I decided to swap it up a bit. An old man's dream comes true. Now, change is something that most people are not particularly fond of, especially when there are changes that seem to be detrimental to one's current way of life. There are others who not only embrace change, but they also try to push others to embrace it, whether they want to or not. I think of the line, change is good, you go first. Okay? Think about the efforts, as an example, in our own county to try to change our rural lifestyle to a more suburban one, wanting to make Sevier County into a second Cedar City or a Spanish Fork, for no other reason because, honestly, such a change would pad the pockets of those pushing for such a transformation. Forget what the whole community wants as a whole. They look at us as these Luddites that we don't understand that progress is good, even if said progress, increases crime, increases pollution, creates water shortages, and, might degrade the quality of life for those who came here to escape such a lifestyle. It doesn't matter if there's no way for such a transformation to be sustained due to our valley's location. We're too far away from any urban center to be a bedroom community. So you'd have to change the whole nature of this valley in order to do so. And once farmland has been converted to high-density housing, there is no way for it to be converted back if the housing stays empty due to lack of affordability. And you may say, well, you seem pretty confident about that. I've seen it happen. I went to college in Riverside, and right next to Riverside, California, there was an area called Moreno Valley. Well, it wasn't called that back then. It was a farming community with 3 little towns in there. You had Edgemont, you had Sunnymead, and Moreno. And you could drive out there and go through fields. Yeah, there was some growth around Sunnymead. That was the biggest of them. And to be honest, Edgemont was something of a slum. But in 1984, they incorporated into the city of Moreno Valley, including their own built-in slum. And suddenly the farms disappeared. Literally, you'd be driving along, you'd see the harvesters out there getting the wheat and corn and whatever else they were growing. After the harvest, then the bulldozers came in, and then they would build this high-density housing. And when I said high-density, imagine fair-sized houses, say about the size of this building, on a lot about the same size, maybe a little bigger to give you a tiny backyard and a little bigger front yard. And your neighbor essentially was, about where the street is. I'm talking about the curb. And that's your neighbor on both sides. And each house pretty much looked alike. Well, pretty much. They were reversed sometimes. So if people were telling you how to get to their home, they give you this address. And of course, you go into this thing. It's like, well, which house is it? Well, the chimney's on the right. Cool. That just eliminated half the houses. Everything else looks the same. And change is good. We got a growing city here. And it is. They're regretting it. Because now that rural nature of that whole area is gone. And in fact, it's not a great place to live. No, change is not good. Now, change can be good, though. Okay? But it has to be good for everyone, not just a select few. And this is how I look at it. For example, a good change for our own community would be a sewer system. If you live in Monroe, you pay about, I think it's $5 a month toward a sewer charge. Now, if you live here, there's no sewer. The only sewer we've got is our individual septic tanks. That's because the city is trying to save up for a sewer system. And it would be a good thing, though there would be a period of inconvenience while they were installing the whole thing and then hooking everybody up to it. But it would really be nice not to have to, pump out one septic tank periodically or replace it when it was too old. And be terribly honest, I wouldn't mind seeing a Harbor Freight in town, or Cal Ranch, or even an In-N-Out or a Chick-fil-A. Del Taco would be nice too, to give Taco Bell and Taco Time a little competition and show them what fast food Mexican really should be like. But it's not like it's an absolute necessity. Okay? If I want my Taco Bell fix, okay, I'll either go to Spanish Fork or go to Cedar City. It's not that big of a deal. Same for Harbor Freight. But consider, and some people who've lived here long enough, you may remember when natural gas became available and people were able to retire their old oil or coal furnaces. I'm sure there were people who grumbled about it, but eventually the change did happen, and now everybody's pretty happy with it. You see, changes that benefit everyone without trying, the changes that benefit everyone, you don't have to try to sell people on the idea. These are good changes, and they should be embraced. But there are other changes that are much harder to embrace, that are either inevitable or good in their own way. And I'm getting in that region, so I don't feel self-conscious about talking about it, and that is the change that many elderly people fear and resist. Okay, no, I'm not ancient, but I'm now officially a senior citizen. And I understand that a lot of people don't like change. I think of my own mother, for example, when it took COVID closing down Disneyland just to get her up from Southern California to live with us here in Utah. And you think, well, yeah, you have to consider that my mother lived in a travel trailer outside of a perfectly good house that she could have lived in, but because there were too many memories, she would refuse to live in the house. She lived in an old travel trailer that was getting very dilapidated. It was unsafe, but it was something she was familiar with. It's something she liked. And even after coming up here, we kept hearing all about how I have to go back there. I need to go back. For what? Well, I'm more comfortable there. You've got and those of you who know me know that she actually got everything moving up here, everything she wanted. She had a nice house to live in. She had lived on a lot of property. We had animals and birds that she loved looking at and loved feeding. She had what she wanted, but it wasn't her familiar surroundings, as crummy as they were. There are other reasons too. When you live in a place you are familiar with and you hold on to, you have a feeling of confidence because, hey, I got this, I built this, and I have a certain amount of control over my surroundings that makes it feel safer and happier. And sometimes change is inevitable, okay, for whatever reason. But the thing about it is, sometimes it's for the better. And it's hard a lot of times for people to see that. Now, if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn it to Genesis chapter 46. We're going to be starting in verse 1. Okay. We're going to be looking at such a change, a hard change for one Jacob. Okay, we've been talking about him for a while. He had lived with his family in a place called Hebron for many, many years. And he had endured many hardships, as we have seen, from losing, and I'm going to put that word in quotes, a son, to, of course, losing both his wives to death, and then dealing with 10 other sons that he really never trusted. And in fact, as we saw, he never really acknowledged them as his own. And for 22 years, he lived in depression, seemingly just waiting for his time to die and just leave it all behind. And I'm sure this made it for a joyless life. I mean, he was very down about everything that happened. And as we saw last week, suddenly everything changed, not only for Jacob, but for his whole family. Now remember, his lost son, Joseph, he discovers, boom, he's not dead. Jacob, the type of person that seemed to come up with the worst case scenario, though no one told him a thing, had assumed that his favorite, Joseph, had been killed and devoured by a wild beast, probably, in a gruesome way. And he found out, no, Joseph's still alive. At first he didn't believe it, and then he realized, wow, he is alive. And not only that, he's a high government official in Egypt. He's the Grand Vizier. He's second only to Pharaoh as ruler of the land. And then Joseph is saying, look, we've got 5 more years of famine. He arranged for all the family from Jacob on down to move to Egypt so they could live safely without impoverishing themselves, constantly traveling back and forth for food. Food costs money. And the further you go, the more food you had to buy because you had to feed your pack animals along the way. And he saw that, hey, guess what? If you are going back and forth for food, I don't care how rich Dad is, that money's going to eventually go away. It's 5 years to more. So come on down. The time had come. Come on down. And Jacob heard this, and at first he thought, wow, what a great idea. He's looking forward to it. But as we're going to see now, he actually had some second thoughts. So let's look at this change. Let's look at Jacob. Genesis chapter 46, starting in verse 1. So Israel, Jacob, took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father, Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt. I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So here's what happened. Jacob and his family, they basically packed up. Joseph had provided all these carts and everything. They loaded the carts. Jacob rode on one. The women and children rode on the different carts. And they had been there for quite some time, probably about 20 years, okay, a little longer than that. And they traveled for about a week until they arrived at a place called Beersheba, which is the southernmost town in the land of Canaan. Now, Beersheba, we've heard that name before because it's a very special place to Jacob. This was where Abraham had dug a well. In fact, that's what Beersheba means. And there he lived after offering Isaac up as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. And of course, God provided a different ram for the sacrifice. Isaac, in turn, also lived at Beersheba. And it was there, that Jacob left after he deceived his father and cheated his brother. He left from Beersheba to go back to Laban's house to find a wife. Okay? So Beersheba was a very special place. Not only now we see Jacob having a vision, but he appeared there to Isaac as well, as we went way earlier to Hagar, Abraham's concubine. This is a very special place. Okay? Now, Jacob up and left, but now he starts making these sacrifices. He pauses to build an altar and make some sacrifices to the Lord. And I think a lot of it was maybe he was having second thoughts about going. Okay? After all, he knew Hebron. He knew Beersheba. And now it's like, okay, Lord, should I go? Honestly, you probably should have asked the question to begin with. But also, he's thinking about, maybe this is not a good idea. Okay? Why? Well, why are you arguing with the issue? If Joseph said to come, then obviously it's okay. Yeah. And what's the wisest thing to do because of the famine? Well, yeah. But Jacob's sitting here thinking his grandfather Abraham had gotten into serious trouble by going to Egypt. He knew that Abraham's nephew Lot had turned to sinful Sodom as a place to live, largely because of the influence of living in Egypt for a time. And when Isaac, Jacob's father, started moving toward Egypt, the Lord stopped him and says, don't go to Egypt. Okay? So Jacob's thinking, maybe just because Joseph's telling me to come, maybe this is not what the Lord wants me to do. It's a dangerous place, Should I stay or should I go? Okay, should I stay here where I could see my son, or should I go to see my son? Am I allowing my emotions to dictate what I'm doing instead of letting the Lord lead? And that's why he stopped. And that's why he made a sacrifice. I think at that point he's thinking, yeah, maybe we should stop for a moment. Lord, what do you want me to do? And this is a good thing for anyone to get in, a good habit for anyone to get into. Over the years in ministry, I have seen many a family go up and have the pastor pray over them when they were moving away, sometimes to start a church somewhere, sometimes someone's job moved them out of state. But they always ask the pastor, could you pray for us? Is this what you want us to do? I had friends who were Christians who were in the military. When the family had to move from one base to another, same thing. They came to the church. They asked the pastor to pray over them, to bless them, and the whole family's up there. And I think Jacob wanted to do the same thing. I think he realized, I really have not done my best as a believer of God. He's looking back over the past years. He had a great testimony coming out of Bethel, but then all the different things that happened. You had the slaughter at Shechem that his sons committed. They had Joseph. Now he found out Joseph basically was sold by his brothers to Egypt as a slave, and he's realizing, I'm not the spiritual leader I should have been. So now he's trying to make up for it. And fortunately, the Lord doesn't sit there and say, well, it's about time you called me. No, he's always faithful when one of his servants inquired for wisdom. And he came to Jacob by night and assured him that it was okay, it was safe for him and his family to go to Egypt. Okay? And it's neat. He calls him by name, Jacob, Jacob. Okay? And Jacob recognized, yes, Lord, here I am. Okay? Really, it's neat to know that the Lord knows our names. He knows our personal needs too. So no matter what we do, we need to go to him and ask him for what he wants us to do. And he is faithful to let us know. And the Lord wanted to remind Jacob that he was not just the God in Canaan. Now back then, this was kind of the religious philosophy in that area, that your family God was only good in a certain location, okay? And as I mentioned before, when Joseph talked about Elohim to his brothers before they knew he was their brother, this was a hint of who Joseph was, because Elohim was not known outside of the Jacob's family. How would this guy know the name of God? Okay, well, they weren't thinking, obviously. And so he's saying, no, I'm not limited to Canaan. I'm going to be with you wherever you go, because he is the Lord of earth, including Egypt. All right? And so God was going to be with Jacob. He'd be with him when he went to Egypt. He'd be there to bless him, just as he had been with Joseph and blessing Joseph. So basically, Jacob, you got nothing to fear. God's telling him, you're good. Don't worry about it. I'm going to keep the promises I made to you in Bethel. Okay? I'm going to make of you a great nation. He repeats that promise here. Okay? And so now we are going to see that take place. So really, to be honest, Jacob's move to Egypt was not just prompted by Joseph's invitation nor the old man's desire to see his favorite son again. It was divinely authorized. It was God said, do it, and do it now. And it's interesting that this passage records the only divine vision in the Joseph story. Okay? Yeah, Joseph had dreams, and then other people had dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. But this is the only time in this Joseph story that we actually see God talking with somebody directly. Okay? The stay in Egypt, that was the other thing he mentioned. It's only going to be temporary. Okay? Because essentially God's saying, I'm going to go down, I'm going to be with you, and I will bring you back out again. So it was part of his divine purpose. And maybe at the moment they didn't see it. Remember, God rarely shows the whole plan to anybody. Okay, he just shows little snippets at a time. Okay, you have to do step 1 in order to get to step 2. So once you do step 1, boom, here's step 2. Now you got to do that to go on to step 3. This is what's happening here. Now, on a logical level, based on what we know of what is next in the story of the children of Israel, if we've seen the Ten Commandments, we know what's going to happen. There does seem to be a potential problem in this plan with Jacob leaving Canaan, because Canaan was the land of promise and Egypt became the land of slavery. How is this a good exchange? Why would God want Jacob's family to live in Egypt? Well, because in Egypt, they would be able to multiply into a great nation, okay? And they would begin their sojourn in Egypt under the protection of a friendly Pharaoh, and they would enjoy the best of the land. This would allow them to actually prosper, okay? When things are tight, people don't tend to reproduce because a lot of times children don't survive, okay? When everybody's comfortable, that's a totally different story. Within 400 years, however, the Jews will be suffering cruel bondage in Egypt and crying out to God for deliverance. And God was going to use that to mold them into a mighty nation. And when we hit the book of Exodus, we're going to see this process take place. Okay? Go back to Jacob. Okay? There's another statement here. It says, Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. This was basically God telling Jacob that though he's going to die in Egypt, it's like, look, you're going to go down there, you're going to die, but Joseph is going to see to it that you have an honorable funeral. Okay? They're just not going to throw you in the river or do something weird. You know, another way of translating this, Joseph will put his hand on your eyes, is Joseph will close your eyes. Okay? Traditionally, it was the job of the firstborn next to dad when dad died. As he died, despite what movies or TV will show you, no, most of the time your eyes do not close. They stay wide open. So it's kind of up to the whoever's by there, usually the firstborn, to close the eyes in symbolizing death. Basically, it's like, Jacob, you're going to die in peace. Yeah, you've had a rough life up to now. Now enjoy the sunset of your years, but you're going to die in peace, and Joseph is going to be acting as your firstborn. Okay, so now we see God's approval on what Jacob had been wanting to do all along. Replace his other sons with Joseph as the firstborn. And, as we're going to read, Jacob's body is going to be brought back to Canaan. He's going to be buried in the same cave near Hebron where his family was, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and his wife Leah. They were all buried in the same cave, and that's where Jacob's going to be buried as well. I imagine this was quite a relief for Jacob. He's thinking, oh, good, okay, no problem. Lord, you want me to go? Let's go. So, verse 5, Jacob leaves, goes on from there. Verse 5, then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. So they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt. Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons, his sons' sons, his daughters, and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. Okay, let's pause there again. Now, it's interesting. Pharaoh told them, don't bother to bring your possessions, since, you've got all the wealth and all the land, the fat of the land of Egypt is here before you, so you don't need to bring anything. In a way, it's like saying, look, don't worry about bringing the furniture in your old house. Just leave it in the old house. We'll get you brand new stuff. That's essentially what he said. But that's not really it was not that easy, okay? Because it would have been cruel for Jacob and his family to abandon their livestock during a famine. And no doubt they brought some of their personal possessions that they treasured. There was sentimental stuff, who knows what was in the tents. So they brought them all. I'm like, no, we're not leaving behind. We'll take everything. So this made for a very large caravan. And I wonder if this were the first time that Jacob was actually able to see his entire extended family all together at once. Okay? Yeah, it seemed like they scattered about quite a bit, but now they're in this huge caravan. And he's sitting there looking around him. In fact, as we're going to find, the number there's 70, actually 66 at this point. He didn't count Joseph and his sons down there. He had 66 people, 67 people with him. And he's looking around. It's like, wow, the Lord really did keep his promise. Remember, he had said at Bethel, look, when he came back with Laban, he at Bethel, he's there said, look, Lord, I went across this river with just a staff. And now look at what I have coming back from Laban. And I'm wondering if he's looking back thinking, wow, look what I got now. I thought that was a big crowd. This is even bigger. And I don't think any of them realized what was happening. They were very special people to the Lord. They were his chosen people. And he had important work for them to do in the years ahead. And as we know, the Jews are going to be bringing blessings to the entire world at some point in the form of Jesus Christ. But at the moment, I think he was just overwhelmed. Wow, I got a big family. That's a lot of people I'm dealing with. Look at all those flocks. Look at all those herds. Whoa. Again, I think a lot of it because he was in depression, he never noticed it. Oftentimes when a person is down, they view more of what they don't have as opposed to really looking with clarity at what they do have. Okay? Yeah, Joseph may not be here, but look what else you've got. I don't care. Joseph's over. I'm crying over Joseph. And now that he's going to see Joseph again, he's realizing just how blessed he was. Now, as happens quite a bit here in Genesis, we pause for a moment to list out those who were making the trip. So we'll kind of go through it in verse 8. Now these were the names of the children of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn, and the sons of Reuben were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. And by the way, I'm probably going to hash a lot of these. Just bear with me, okay? The sons of Simeon were Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, a son of a Canaanite woman, okay? The sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Keep those in mind. We're not going to deal with them immediately, but these three names are going to figure prominently in the book of Exodus. But we'll talk about when we get there. Verse 12. The sons of Judah were Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. The sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. Again, it's interesting that they're brought up, but remember, it was through Perez that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is going to come. That's why it's placed here. It's like, that was rather random. He doesn't talk about any of the other grandkids. Yes, but there's a reason why this was brought in. Verse 13, the sons of Issachar were Tola, Puvah, Job, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun were Sered, Elon. And yeah, Elon is an actual name. Okay, everyone thinks of Elon Musk. That's a fake name. No, there it is. It's a biblical name, believe it or not. If I remember, I think Elon came from a Jewish family. If I remember, I'm not sure about that. Okay, verse 15. These were the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Paddan Aram with his daughter Dinah. All the persons, his sons and his daughters, were 33. The sons of Gad were Ziphion, Haggai, Shuni, Ezbon, Eri, Erodai, and Eroi. The sons of Asher were Jimnah, Ishua, Isui, Beriah, and Sarah, their sister. And the sons of Beriah were Heber and Malchiel. And these were the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to Leah, his daughter, and these she bore to Jacob, 16 persons. The sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, were Joseph and Benjamin, and to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. The sons of Benjamin were Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ahi, Rosh, Muppin, and Huppim, and Ard. These were the sons of Rachel, who were born to Jacob, 14 persons in all. The sons of Dan, or the son of Dan was Hushim. The sons of Naphtali were Jazreel, Guni, Jezer, and Shillem. These were the sons of Bilhah, whom Laban gave to Rachel his daughter, and she bore these to Jacob, 7 persons in all. All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. Okay? All right. Why is this important? It's just a list. Well, first off, let's kind of look at this thing. In typical Semitic fashion, the males are named on this list, but not the females, except for 2 daughters, Dinah, who we all already know why. She figured prominently earlier. And why Asher's daughter Sarah was mentioned, we don't know. So, daughters, the plural, was probably referring to daughters-in-law, since we know of no other daughters born to Jacob. Okay? There may be other daughters that were not mentioned. 2 of them were mentioned, but we don't know. There may have been others. We have not been told. The record lists first the sons, daughter, and grandsons of Leah, followed by the families of Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah, and this comes up to 70 people making the trip. Now, just of note, okay, and I should mention this, Hezron and Hamul, the sons of Perez, okay, were, probably born in Egypt. You may say, well, why is that? Well, their ages. Also, if you look at the sons of Benjamin, they were born in Egypt as well, because Benjamin was only 23 when he came to Egypt. That's an awful lot of kids for a guy to have in so short a time, okay? And it's just like, Joseph's sons were born in Egypt. So this is a list inclusive of those who were going to be born. These guys are just not old enough to have kids yet, okay? And likely Benjamin may not have even been married. We don't know. So again, I'm looking at, Jacob's looking at this list, okay? And he's wondering, okay, here we go. And again, you see the beginnings of the promise. At some point, his descendants are going to become as numberless as the sands of the sea and the stars of the heavens. God's going to keep his promise. Again, I'm wondering if he's naming these people. Well, I wonder what's going to happen next. And now we get to see another reunion that was 22 years in the making. Verse 28. Then he, Jacob, sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. And they came to the land of Goshen. So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. A couple of things in this little passage here to look at. First, it was Judah, not Joseph, who led the sons of Israel to Goshen. Okay? Judah, apparently Judah is singled out, and we've seen this before, how it seems like Judah versus Joseph. Okay? It's most of the time not really in an antagonistic way, but we're going to see this as we move on, that there is a distinct gap between Joseph and Judah in the history of the nation of Israel. Now, here we are. It was Joseph who was responsible for the preservation of the family of Jacob, but it was Judah that pointed the way. Okay, he was the one, and that a lot of translations say it. He wanted to get directions to get to the land of Goshen. And it showed that Jacob, I think, now really trusted this is his 4th born son. He really trusted him. Why? Well, even though it doesn't say, it suggests that they confessed. Yeah, we sold Joseph into slavery. And I think Judah confessed, I'm the one that suggested it. It was my idea. Sorry, Dad, I really asked for forgiveness. And I think Jacob did. Because now Judah's kind of taking the lead when Joseph's not around. And I think Jacob also may have had enough spiritual insight to see, I now understand what God was doing. Oftentimes when we're going through bad times, we don't see the plan of God. Okay, as I mentioned before, my first wife died of cancer. I had no clue what God was doing. Obviously, it was not God's will that she live. Why? I have no clue. But afterwards, you look back and you see, okay, I think I see a part of the plan. I don't claim to see all of it. And I think Jacob at this point was saying, yeah, I get it, what's going on now. Okay, Judah, find out where we're supposed to go. Now, speaking of Goshen, we've talked about this place before, but now let's take a look at actually where it is. I don't know how well you see the map. This is Egypt. Egypt is actually split up into two kingdoms, two areas. You have Upper Egypt, which is actually further south of here. This is up in the highlands. And then this whole area is known as Lower Egypt because these are the mountains down here. The Nile goes downstream into the Mediterranean. And Goshen was in this area up here, okay, where that little red dot is. Now, Goshen, why Goshen? Why was that chosen? And it's described as the best of the land, okay? Why would they go there if it's such a desirable area? Well, guess what? Not a lot of Egyptians live there. And we're going to see why this is important. It's probably one of the most fertile areas, but it's not a good farming area. But they have a lot of areas, a lot of places to graze livestock, okay? There's a lot of water, as you can see. It's within the Nile Delta, so water is not going to be an issue. And it's huge. So there they are. This is the place they're going to go. And it's separated from the Egyptians, and we'll see the significance of that in a second. So once Joseph heard, getting back to the reunion, once Joseph heard that Dad was on his way, Joseph hops in his own chariot, and he meets the caravan. And probably Jacob was riding in the first cart, and for the fifth time, Joseph is crying. He's weeping. And it's interesting, and I wonder why it's not mentioned. There's no specific statement that Jacob wept as well. And we know Jacob was an emotional man. He was not Mr., he's not man's man. That was Esau, and even Esau would bawl when things were going rough. And when he reunited with Jacob, Esau wept. So I'm not sure why Jacob did not weep, if it was merely just assumed that he did. Some scholars think that maybe he was so overcome with joy in Thanksgiving that he was unable to shed any tears. Here's my son Joseph after all these years. My own opinion, and that with a couple bucks will get you a cup of coffee at McDonald's, okay? My own opinion is that he was moved to tears. I'm sorry, I don't care. Something this emotionally important, I don't think someone's going to stay stoic and do nothing. He may not have been bawling, but I'm sure he had tears in his eyes, even if he didn't show much emotion beyond that. Then he makes an interesting statement. This kind of tells it all. Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. Well, it seems like he's still kind of preoccupied with sorrow and death, rather with the joy of meeting his son, his favorite son, after all these years. I mean, here we are. They're all reunited. And Joseph's dreams, when he had as a teenager, they had all come true. And now it was time to prepare them for life in their new location. So let's move on. Verse 31. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me, and the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers. That you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brother and their flocks and their herds and all that they possess, they have come from the land of Canaan. Indeed, they are in the land of Goshen. And he, Joseph, took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen, and if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Okay. Now, though Joseph was second to Pharaoh in ruling the land, it was still necessary for Joseph's family to be officially presented at court as members of Joseph's family. Essentially, they had now become new members of the royal family in Egypt. And this was because, Joseph and Pharaoh, they were very close. Okay? And since they had already agreed to settle the family in Goshen, this presentation, their appearance at court, was a formality. And you could see some of the formal statements. It was already known, yeah, you're going to live here. But they still had to ask permission. With your permission, can we live here? And Pharaoh saying, of course you can. Very, very much a ceremony, but it was an important one. Okay? And the reason Joseph took so much time kind of brushing his brothers up on Egyptian customs, well, when he was a slave and had first arrived at Egypt, he had no clue what to expect. He was completely ignorant of the customs. He had to learn them as he went along. Okay? And he knew his family was probably just as ignorant. In fact, he remember how scared they were. Oh, they'll make us slaves just because they can. And Joseph knew better. It's like, no, they're not going to make you slaves. Okay? But he knew the fear. That's why when we looked at it before, he played on that fear. Okay? So he's letting them know this is not what's going to happen. You need to let them know this is acceptable, and no, that would be considered a faux pas. You don't do something like that. And in particular, they needed to understand what it meant to be a shepherd in Egypt. Now, the fact that the family had brought their flocks and herds, they were obviously there for the long haul. They knew that they were going to stay in Egypt for a while, and they wanted to continue their primary occupation. Now, Joseph knew that the Egyptians were prejudiced against shepherds, so he tried to emphasize, okay, don't just talk about the sheep. You got herds of cattle here, okay? And when the boys answered the question, they didn't lie. They basically told them everything. This is what we do. This is what we have. Pharaoh was very impressed because it's obvious they were telling the truth. But this does bring up a question. What did the Egyptians have against shepherds? Okay? Because, the Bible doesn't really tell us. But there are indications from history of why this is so. They felt that shepherds were unclean on a variety of levels. And when we get into Exodus and the rest of the law, shepherds were also kind of considered unclean as well, which is why when Jesus' birth was announced, he wasn't, it's interesting, the angels didn't sing to the religious elite at the temple. They sang to a bunch of shepherds in the field outside of Bethlehem. And this was showing that, no, there's no such thing as unclean anymore because shepherds were considered ritually unclean. It probably started with the Egyptians. First off, the ancient Egyptians were known for their high standards of cleanliness, which compared to today, there's still a bunch of slobs. But back then, they considered themselves, they were very, very concerned about their own appearance. So that's why they preferred to wear linen, because it kept them cool and dry in the hot climate of Egypt. And linen was spun from flax, okay, which was all over the place down there. And the residents of Canaan, on the other hand, they generally wore garments of wool or goat skin because it was available. They had a lot of sheep. They had to shear the sheep on a regular basis. That's where they made their clothes from. Okay? Now, though wool, leather, and goat hair were available to the ancient Egyptians, the Egyptians themselves, they considered that material is dirty. Okay? Because, one, they were going to make them especially hot and sweaty. Okay? And if you're sweaty, you stink. And then these animal skins and fibers, they had a tendency to retain odors. Okay? And back then they didn't have washing machines or anything like that. They didn't have detergent. Thus, part of the reason why the Egyptians considered shepherds detestable, to be blunt, because they stank. They smelled like animals. They smelled like sweat. Okay? And we can't have that. That's not right. And some people think this is why Joseph gave his brothers garments before they left the last time, Egyptian garments, so they would be more socially acceptable. It's like, probably told him, yeah, wear the ones, remember that stuff I gave you? Wear that when you go see Pharaoh. Don't wear your stinky old cloaks. Okay? And then there was the religious purity aspect. Wool was considered unclean, as we said, in Egypt, so they were not allowed to wear it inside an Egyptian temple. And Egyptian priests were not allowed to wear wool or leather sandals at all. And something interesting, the sacrifice of rams, sheep, and goats, this was considered a detestable practice to the Egyptians because the Egyptians worshipped a ram idol, basically a man with a ram's head. This was their god named Khnum, who is thought to be the creator of humanity by molding humans out of clay. Okay? Now, Jacob and his family knew that the creator was Yahweh, okay, not Khnum. So as shepherds, the Hebrews would sacrifice their flocks to Yahweh, and this would be interpreted as showing disrespect to Khnum. And now we can finish answering the questions. Why were they settled in Goshen? It's simple, okay? Considering the family's livestock business and the Egyptians' attitude toward them, the less contact the Hebrews had with the Egyptians, the better it was. Now, Joseph essentially ensured that they lived separately from most of the Egyptians. As we mentioned, even though it was a fertile land, the land of Goshen was sparsely populated. And Joseph was careful to keep his brothers as herdsmen as well as shepherds, which could only be achieved in that corner of Egypt. And it's interesting to note, the Bible doesn't say anything about Joseph trying to get his brothers into high positions of government office. The Bible would have said if they had. He didn't. No. The highest they would get was to be the official herdsman of the Pharaoh. That's it. Why? Because nobody else wanted the job. But they were really good at it. Okay? So the bottom line is he wanted to make a lot of peace. He knew that the Egyptians looked at the Hebrews or any outsider kind of with, all right, I don't know, because they're kind of sketch. That's how they looked at him. He wanted to make sure that they kept to themselves as much as possible and that they were less likely to mingle, and then whatever, the flocks and the herds, they'd be able to continue to do their work without any outside interference. Now it says that he presented 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh. We have no clue which of them were chosen. Okay, but Joseph knew who would make the best impression. And as I said, they went through the ritual. Can we stay here? Yes, you can. And Pharaoh kept his promise, made good on the promises that it was the best land for their families and flocks and herds, and requested, again, hey, watch mine as well. And that was the end of that particular audience. Okay? But now it was time for Jacob's turn to meet Pharaoh. Verse 7. Or, by the way, we skipped into chapter 47. But, yeah, if you hadn't figured it out yet. So, chapter 47, verse 7. Then Joseph brought in his father, Jacob, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimages. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. Pharaoh probably up to this point had heard a lot from Joseph about his father. Clearly Joseph loved his father. And I think Pharaoh was anxious to meet him. He's like, who is this guy? I've heard so much about him. I can't wait to meet him. And so there they are. Now it says he set his father before him. This almost gives the impression that Jacob was having a hard time walking, that maybe they set a chair for him. But nevertheless, that probably didn't happen. Pharaoh, after all, was royalty. Royalty sat, but when you were presented royalty, you stood. So I think it was just a way of saying, okay, yeah, you brought him in, and there he was. But I have to wonder why the first question out of Pharaoh's mouth was, how old are you? Okay? My guess is that I have to remember a couple of things about Egypt. The average lifespan at this point in time in Egypt was around 40. Okay, obviously some got older. But seeing someone who is a centenarian, as they say, someone who's over 100, I doubt if Pharaoh ever set his eyes on anybody that old, because it just didn't happen. Despite how, quote-unquote, clean they were, by modern standards, they weren't. And so I'm sure he's like, oh, wow, how old are you? Probably there's a reason. It's not just a formality to say such a thing as that. And also, I kind of wonder, it's interesting when Jacob arrived, the first thing Jacob does is to bless Pharaoh in the name of Yahweh. Okay, I'm going to give you a blessing. And you probably used the name Elohim, which Joseph used. And then he did it a second time at the end of the interview. And Jacob was a good example of how a true believer is to relate to those who are outside the family of God, being respectful, polite, and clearly making their faith to the Lord fairly obvious to those around him. Okay? So, Jacob makes these blessings and now says, and I'm sure there is more to the conversation about, gee, how old are you? But it's interesting how Jacob answers that question. Okay? He calls his life a pilgrimage. Now, a lot of people, when they describe their lives, they use different terms. I've heard people that says it was a battle, it was a race, or it was a trap. That's a bad one. It was a puzzle. Okay? Jacob said it was a pilgrimage, and he applied it even to his own father and grandfather, because they were pilgrims and strangers on the earth, and so are we. Okay? We are pilgrims here on this earth. Even though we were born here, we live here as believers, we are still pilgrims. There's an old hymn, you've heard me quote this one before. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. And Jacob felt the same way. Abraham and Isaac did as well, because our time here is brief and temporary, and we're eagerly looking forward to our permanent home. Okay? Now, Jacob goes on. He says, it's my pilgrimage. And he says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And I'm sure Pharaoh's looking at him, 130 years, you think that's few? Okay? But Jacob had a point. He mentions that he's not even as old as what his father and grandfather got. Abraham died at 175. Isaac died at 180. Yeah, 130, you're not quite there yet. And be honest, as we're going to find out, Jacob is going to die at 147, so even then he doesn't make it. But even then, when he says his life was evil, we're not talking wickedness, but rather it probably would have been better rendered as part of misery and distress. And as we've seen, Jacob lived a very difficult life, and a lot of that misery was self-inflicted because of things that he chose to do. Okay? And even then, he's still not looking at the fact that time is over. He's still kind of focused on the past, how bad life was. But life is going to go on. However, we have another side note here concerning the famine. Verse 11. Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number in their families. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed." And Joseph said, Give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, and the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate." Then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's, and for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other, and only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. Then Joseph said to the people, "Indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Stop there. Okay? So, basically, once everything is settled down, our point of view now turns back to the famine as a whole. Now, it's interesting to note that though Jacob's family was adequately cared for, Joseph still did not play favorites. He gave them what they were allotted, nothing more. Okay? You get, say, 20 pounds of grain per month per person. That's all you're getting. They're not giving you any more. So Joseph definitely did not play favorites, even with his own family. And, of course, the money, when they say the money failed, what was happening? Well, the Egyptians showed up. They paid money, got grain. When they ran out, they came back, gave more money. And there was a point where finally the money ran out. That's when they say the money failed. It wasn't that the dollar crashed or something like that. Nobody had any money. Part of the problem was a lot of these guys were farmers. The food, if they couldn't farm, they couldn't make money, so the money wasn't coming from anywhere. So, they became poor, and finally they started to barter. Look, we have no money. Okay, Joseph says, we'll barter your livestock instead of for grain instead of for money. And so for a year, the sheep, the goats, the donkeys, everything became property of the government. And at some point, doesn't say how much longer, but probably getting closer to the end of that 7-year period, they sold themselves. We're slaves. Our land is Pharaoh's. And at that point, they didn't need to trade anything. They were just given it because, hey, yeah, you're servants now. We feed our servants. And to make food distribution easier, they started bringing everybody in from the outlying areas, farm workers probably, because they were doing nothing out there. There's no, it's still famine. They couldn't farm anything. So they brought them into the cities so they could feed them easier. It wasn't because they were being dictators. It's like, look, you want food, you need to come and get it. All right? So by the time the famine ended, okay, and farming could begin again, Pharaoh basically controlled everything. Okay? He owned all the money, all the land, all the people, and their property, except for the priests. Okay? And that's when he started giving out probably the last of the grain they had saved up. And now, okay, start planting. But when you plant, there's a tax. You have to give 1/5 of what you have to Pharaoh. Okay? And it may have been a tax. I'm thinking more it was, let's just have it here just in case we get another famine coming in. We don't want to get caught off guard if we have another famine. That's just kind of, we're putting it aside for a rainy day. And people, instead of being, oh man, we're slaves, or we're horrible, they thanked Joseph for what he had done. You saved our lives. Interesting. You lost all your freedom, but I saved your life. Cool. You lost our freedoms. And in the process, Joseph set up a centrally controlled economic system that enabled this Pharaoh and succeeding pharaohs, because it says from this day forward, it's their main ways of taxation, and now Pharaoh owned everything. Pharaoh became an absolute ruler. And as we saw here, Jacob's family continued to grow. I mean, they came in with 70. As we are going to see in the book of Exodus, 400 years later, the Israelites will number in the region of about 2 million. That's quite a growth. And Exodus 12 tells us there were 600,000 adult males. So if you add the women and children, it probably added up to 1 to 2 million. This would not have happened in Canaan because of the constraints of the famine. This could only have happened in Egypt. And it's interesting. God had promised to make Israel a great nation, and you could see he's already doing it. It's already happening. So we're going to stop here today. We'll continue on with Jacob next week. The whole passage of the scripture, now obviously, as we've talked about how when God guides, God provides, it doesn't apply just to money, but God has this plan that he wants the best for us, even if it seems like we're going through hard times, even if it doesn't make any sense. As I've shared, a lot of people, when I felt called to come up here to plant a church, I retired at 55. That was the earliest I could retire as a teacher in California. And I had had 30 years under my belt. But the logic of the situation said, no, you need to, wait until you're 60. Because if you wait till you're 60, then you get your full retirement. Okay? And, you'll make more money, you'll be better off. That wasn't what God wanted. That was the logic of the situation. That's not what God wanted. Okay? He's provided for us. I don't worry about it. And I'm glad I didn't wait till I was 60, because I would have had to deal with COVID down there. No, thank you. Very happy that I'm up here. But there's another lesson in this passage besides just leaning on God. There's an interesting point that Christians today tend to ignore. Pharaoh was the one, even though Joseph was the second ruler, ultimately Pharaoh was the one who basically allowed the Jews to stay in Egypt. He owned the land. It was his to give. And the thing was, Pharaoh was a pagan ruler. He worshipped a pantheon of false gods. And the Lord still worked in his heart and used him to take care of Jacob and his family. And why is this so important? Well, unfortunately, there are too many believers today who think that God can only use his own people in places of authority. I've heard this from many people. Oh yeah, we need to pray for Christians as president, and Christians in Congress, and Christians as governor, da 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 da. And the thing was, the Bible really does not present that as a truthful statement. Okay? Even in the Old Testament, what we see are when the worship of God was mandated, made by law, which is what a lot of people think that should be the case. What we see is, okay, all outward appearances, these guys are doing okay, but as soon as that king dies and the law is basically rescinded, boom, it just falls almost instantly right back to where it was. That's because faith cannot be legislated. Okay? Yeah, if it's the law, people, and you know how people try to break the law. I mean, think about people who drive. Yeah, the speed limit's 45, but I'm going to push it to 50. Okay, don't say you haven't done it. I know you have. I have too. Okay, I try not to, but I have to. All right. The Bible teaches that wicked rulers can do God's will. I mean, one of the best examples in the final days of the kingdom of Judah, right before the Babylonian invasion, the prophet Habakkuk, and you can read the book of Habakkuk, it's there. I commend it to you. At some point in the future, we'll get to it. But if you read it, Habakkuk is recording his dismay at how far down the moral state of Judah had fallen. And he was questioning God, why is nothing being done about this? And God replied, oh, I am doing something about it. Okay? He was going to bring the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the nation in judgment. And Habakkuk's reply was, how's that going to work? I mean, the Babylonians are worse than we are. How could that do anything? But God assured him, no, I can use anybody I want to perform my will. And he even calls in different prophecies, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, even though Nebuchadnezzar had no clue he was serving the Lord. Lord still used him. We see the same thing. Cyrus the Greek, or Cyrus the Mede, okay, he's the one that gave the decree to allow the Jews after the Babylonian exile, allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. He was a pagan ruler. He looked at God because he had evidence from people like Daniel. He realized God did things, but he just viewed God as just another one of the pantheons. He's the Jewish God. So but God used him. You see Augustus Caesar in the New Testament. Augustus, for some reason, decides, I want to have a census. That's rather random. So he has a census. Why? So Mary and Joseph can arrive in Bethlehem to register for the census just in time for Jesus to be born. Coincidence? No. Even those who think they are in charge today can be used by the Lord, even if they don't acknowledge God as their God. You think about another story in the Bible. Pilate, when Jesus was on trial, Pilate, he was talking to Jesus. He said, do you realize I have the authority to release you? I have the authority to condemn you and release you. And Jesus, and this is a very broad paraphrase, Jesus really answered, yeah, you have authority here. Only because it was given to you by God. There's nothing you can do to change what God has ordained. He's essentially saying, yeah, you can try to do what you want, but God has a different plan. You're going to go along with it, whether you like it or not. And it's hard, the Bible doesn't tell us tone of voice, but you almost get the impression Jesus is saying, don't worry about this. It's not your fault. He's Pilate, as we've heard when we studied Luke, Pilate was a person he didn't want to be there. He was not a believer in Christ. He was a Roman. But he believed in Roman justice, and he knew, look, everything that's happening here is going against the grain. I want to do what's right. And Jesus basically told him, you're doing just fine. Don't worry about it. This is beyond you. Okay? Don't take it the wrong way. And that's because God is ultimately in control of everything. Nothing takes him by surprise. And that is a comforting fact that even in the worst of times, he's still watching over us. He's bringing us through to the other side. Oftentimes, I describe going through a sad time of life as I am standing at a tunnel. And I've got to walk through that tunnel. I know the light at the other end is not an oncoming train. It is the other side of the tunnel. I don't want to do this, but I have to. But the reason I know is because Jesus is going to be there. It's like, let's get started. Here's the flashlight. Let's do this. And this is beautiful. We praise God that this is a promise we can take to the bank. Father, we thank you again for this time we've had together, and we thank you again for the lessons of your word. And we thank you for the promises you gave to the children of Israel, to Jacob and his descendants, and how those promises moved on even to us. That we are your children, and that you will never leave us nor forsake us. And even if things seem bad, you're still by our sides. As long as we cling to you, you will cling to us. It's like the old poem about footprints, is when we look back and we see one set of footprints, we don't wonder where you went. We thank you that you carried us through that hard time. And so, Father, we thank you again for those promises. We thank you for your salvation. We ask you to be with those who are sick today and give them healing and comfort. And we ask for traveling mercies as we head on home. We thank you for the rain as it has happened, as it's going to happen. And Father, we ask you to bring us back safely next week. We praise you, we thank you, we give you all the glory in Jesus' precious name. Amen.